Did you know that during the 19th century, some enslavers and so-called scientists in the American South conducted horrific experiments on enslaved people? These were not medical experiments in the way we think of today. They were cruel tests, often meant to justify white supremacy. One example involved enslaved people being subjected to extreme punishments and public tortures to study pain, obedience, and physical endurance. In some cases, enslaved men and women were exposed to freezing temperatures, flogging, or confinement in tiny, inescapable spaces, all while white spectators observed. The goal wasn't medicine, it was research to prove racist theories about black bodies being stronger, weaker, or fundamentally different from white bodies. Some enslaved women were forced into breeding experiments to see which pairings would produce stronger children for labor. Families were torn apart, and children were often sold off immediately after birth if they were deemed unfit. Even more horrifying, there are documented cases of enslaved people being killed in these so-called experiments, with doctors and white elites collecting data from the bodies afterward. These atrocities weren't widely publicized because newspapers and historians often ignored the daily horrors enslaved people endured. Why this story matters. This history shows that slavery wasn't just about forced labor. It was also about the systematic dehumanization and scientific exploitation of black bodies. It challenges the sanitized versions of history that are often taught in schools and reminds us that the legacy of slavery has deep, painful roots in American society. The lynch law experiments refer to the brutal and systematic acts of racial terror in the United States, particularly from the late 19th to early 20th centuries, where white mobs experimented with new ways to torture, humiliate, and kill black people under the guise of justice. These were not scientific experiments in the laboratory sense, but rather horrifying social experiments in cruelty and control. Methods developed and refined to send a message of white dominance and black submission. Let's break it down carefully. Origins of lynch law. The term lynch law originated in the late 1700s from Charles Lynch, a Virginia plantation owner and judge who organized extra-legal punishment for suspected loyalists during the American Revolution. By the 1800s, lynch law evolved to mean mob justice without trial, usually hangings. After the Civil War, it became a weapon of terror against black Americans. The experiments in terror. During the Jim Crow era, lynchings became rituals of public torture, often carried out before crowds of white men, women, and children. What makes them experimental is how mobs kept inventing new forms of cruelty, testing limits of pain and humiliation. Some methods used included fire and mutilation. Victims were often burned alive, sometimes doused in kerosene and set aflame slowly as the crowd watched. White mobs experimented with how long a person could survive fire or dismemberment. They turned lynchings into community events. Newspapers announced them in advance, trains brought spectators, and photographers documented the killings. The photos were turned into postcards sold for profit. These were experiments in psychological warfare, testing how far public participation and silence could go. Medical and pseudo-scientific curiosity. Some white doctors, scientists, or curious citizens took body parts, skin, bones, genitals, as trophies or for supposed research. These acts blurred the line between mob violence and scientific racism, where black bodies were used to study pain, resistance, or anatomy. It echoed the same mindset seen in the Tuskegee syphilis study and the exploitation of Henrietta Lacks cells later on. Psychological experiments on fear. The broader social experiment was how to control an entire population through terror. Each lynching was meant to test how the black community would respond. Could they be kept docile, afraid to vote, own land, or challenge white supremacy? It was a tool of social conditioning disguised as punishment. Documented horrors. The NAACP documented these atrocities in reports like 30 Years of Lynching in the United States, 1889 to 1918. One example, the lynching of Jesse Washington in Waco, Texas, 1916, is often cited as one of the most gruesome. He was tortured for hours in front of thousands, including city officials. Photographs of the event were sold as souvenirs. Legacy and impact. The so-called lynch law experiments were state-sanctioned terrorism. They shaped America's racial hierarchy. They normalized public torture and mob rule. They traumatized generations of black families. Only in recent decades, through projects like the Equal Justice Initiative's National Memorial for Peace and Justice, have these acts been properly memorialized? 1. Jesse Washington, Waco, Texas, 1916. This case became one of the best-known examples of public lynching used as social control. Washington, a black teenager, was accused of killing his employer. After a short trial, he was seized by a mob outside the courthouse. Thousands of people, including local officials, watched. Photographs were circulated on postcards across the U.S. The NAACP used this case to expose how local authorities tolerated racial terrorism and how the crowd treated it as entertainment. 2. Mary Turner, Lowndes County, Georgia, 1918. Mary Turner publicly protested the lynching of her husband. In response, a white mob killed her in an especially cruel way meant to intimidate any black person, especially women, who dared to speak out. Her death prompted national outrage and became a rallying point for early civil rights organizations demanding federal anti-lynching laws. 3. Sam Hose, Coweta County, Georgia, 1899. Sam Hose's case illustrates how quickly lynch law could replace any legal process. Newspaper reports inflamed white anger with false allegations, and crowds traveled for miles to witness his killing. Pieces of the rope and other souvenirs were taken afterward, a chilling example of how mob violence had become ritualized. 4. Claude Neal, Marianna, Florida, 1934. Neal's killing was announced in advance through radio and newspapers. Reporters and onlookers arrived from several states. This case showed that lynchings were not hidden crimes, but public spectacles meant to reinforce white power and test the limits of government response. The federal government again failed to act despite national attention. The Duluth lynching, Minnesota, 1920. 3 black circus workers were accused of assaulting a white woman. A mob broke into the jail and lynched them downtown, while police did little to stop it. This event proved that lynching wasn't limited to the South. It was a national phenomenon used to keep black Americans in their place. What experiment meant in context? Historians use the term experiments to describe how white mobs and local officials tested how far they could go without punishment, studied the community's reactions to escalating brutality, used public participation and photography as tools of intimidation, blended violence, entertainment, and racial propaganda into one performance of dominance. It was a systematic experiment in social control, not random chaos. Legacy. These events helped fuel the NAACP's anti-lynching campaign and inspired artists and writers, like Billie Holiday's haunting song Strange Fruit. Today, the Equal Justice Initiative's National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, honors more than 4,000 known victims of lynching and reminds visitors of how terror was used to enforce segregation. Ida B. Wells Barnett, 1862 and 1931, a pioneering African-American journalist, activist, and sociologist who was one of the first to systematically investigate and publicly expose the epidemic of lynching in the United States after Reconstruction. Her work on the lynch law and key writings. Wells's activism and investigative journalism are best captured in a series of pamphlets and books published in the 1890s and early 1900s that collectively came to be known as her lynch law investigations. Here are her main works related to that subject. 1. Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, 1892. Her first major anti-lynching pamphlet. It exposes the myths used to justify lynchings, especially the false claim that they avenged assaults on white women. Wells used meticulous data collection from newspapers and legal records to show that most lynchings were used to enforce racial subjugation, not justice. 2. A Red Record, Tabulated Statistics and Alleged Causes of Lynchings in the United States, 1892 to 1893, 1894, 1895. This was her first full-length book on the topic. It systematically documents 241 lynchings, analyzing causes, locations, and victims. Wells also critiques the silence of the federal government and northern newspapers. It remains one of the earliest examples of data-driven investigative journalism. University of North Carolina, Documenting the American South. 3. Mob Rule in New Orleans, 1900, focuses on the 1900 lynching of Robert Charles and the New Orleans race riot. It illustrates how police violence and mob attacks were intertwined in the enforcement of racial order. published under the Chicago Anti-Lynching League, which Wells helped found. Summary of her lynch law argument. Claim: lynch law was not spontaneous justice, but a tool of racial terror designed to reinforce white supremacy. Evidence: statistical and narrative documentation of lynchings disproving sexual assault justifications. Goal: mobilize national and international opinion to demand federal anti-lynching legislation and expose the moral hypocrisy of the U.S. democracy. Historical significance. Wells's meticulous investigations established her as a founder of investigative journalism, a forerunner of civil rights data activism, a global human rights advocate whose work was cited by the NAACP and international anti-racism movements. If you love hidden Black history stories, you have to subscribe to Black History Stories 13, the channel where we uncover shocking truths they never taught in school. But that's not all. Check out Politics Global 1 for the latest political news and global events. And don't miss Alcabulin Reset 101, where we dive into history, culture, and ideas that will make you think differently. Hit subscribe on all 3 channels. Turn on the bell and join the community that's uncovering history, sharing knowledge, and changing the conversation. Don't wait. Subscribe now.